In times when Mr. Harvey was too ill to record his broadcasts, he turned that Herculean responsibility over to the creator and sole writer of the rest of the story, his son. Here's Paul Harvey, Jr.
Now, the rest of the story. It's been said that no man ever dominated an era as Louis XIV dominated 17th century France. In painting and sculpture and architecture, especially in literature, the king was the impulse, the motivating force. In fact, his ideals formed the criteria by which success itself was judged. Louis XIV, the Sun King. Today we debate the components of charisma, but there was no doubt as to what elevated Louis in the eyes of his subjects. And I'm going to tell you what that was. Louis became king at the age of 4 years, 8 months. It was France's prime minister who actually conducted affairs of state. Of course, French kings traditionally deferred to their prime ministers. However, when Louis's prime minister died March 9, 1661, the 22-year-old monarch issued a proclamation that stunned not only France, but all of Europe. He declared that France's king would now assume complete and utter responsibility for ruling his 19 million subjects. Well, the nation's government ministers were astonished, but they accepted the new order. And beginning March 10, the divine right dictatorship of Louis XIV was a reality. He became, quote, God's representative on earth, making all dissent a sin. But though his infallibility might have led to all kinds of recklessness, Louis, as no one had expected, became serene, even moderate. 8 hours a day for the next 54 years, he devoted himself to the administration of every aspect of his kingdom and his culture, from court etiquette to troop movements, from road building to theological disputes. His word was the last word. And you know what else? There was a device by which Louis enhanced his importance, a certain something which emphasized his aura of authority. No, I'm not referring to his embrace of France's great literary figures, clever though that was. Imagine how flattered were the likes of Molière and Jean Racine, and thus inclined to glorify Louis in print. Neither am I referring to Louis building the palace at Versailles, the price tag of which has been compared to that of a modern airport. Nonetheless, he imposed his thought on everything from French art to 17th century urban renewal. And his public image reflected the power he wielded. His bearing was majestically upright. His personality was expressive and vital. He was a tireless hunter, warrior, dancer, a hearty eater, and a notorious lover. But he might not have kept his subjects so reverently impressed without a specific device which he invented and which survived him and his era, eventually to be adopted by the entire Western world. Because Louis, the self-styled Sun King, the universally respected and ultimately influential ruler, he was potentially stifled in his grandeur by what he considered a most uncomfortable shortcoming. He was 5'5" in his stocking feet. So the style he started, accepted today in virtually every walk of Western life, the fashion which he pioneered, originally to showcase his symmetrical legs and to give his royal highness highness. That's right, high heels. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. When you think of high heels, what comes to mind? If you Google high heel shoes, you'll find women's high heel shoes in a variety of styles, priced from between $20 to just under $800. Notice I said women's shoes. You probably won't find a listing for men's high heel shoes. For women, high heel shoes can be sexy, provocative, and used as a beauty aid. Most women would probably agree that the high heel shoes are not practical and are often uncomfortable. Women wouldn't wear them hiking, and I can imagine that driving would be difficult in high heel shoes. The wearer of high heel shoes will often sink when standing in grass. They provide almost no traction on water, ice, or polished floors even. It seems that they weren't designed for walking at all. Well, they weren't. High heel shoes aren't meant to be practical. They're meant to get attention. But it wasn't always that way. High heels were originally used in the 16th century as a form of horse riding footwear in Persia. The gap just in front of the heel of the shoe helped a rider keep his foot in the stirrups. During battle, horse soldiers would stand while riding so they could fire their arrow from his bow. This increased accuracy because his knees and ankles acted as shock absorbers, which lessened the bounce from the running horse. Firing an arrow from the saddle with a horse running at full pace was horribly inaccurate because the rider was jostled so. In the 17th century, all things Persian became fashionable throughout Western Europe and in France. Aristocrats adopted the Persian-styled high-heel shoes to give themselves the appearance of virility and masculinity. The higher the heel, the more masculine a person was considered to be. To the aristocracy, who rarely rode atop a horse, high-heel shoes were totally impractical. But this was the point. This was a sign of privilege, of wealth. One of the best ways to convey status is through impracticality. The upper crust of society used impractical, uncomfortable, and luxurious clothing made from patterns meant to shock the viewer as a sign of wealth. We wear this just because we can. Keep in mind that these were people who weren't working on their feet all day. They weren't walking very far. As Paul Harvey Jr. explained, King Louis XIV was vertically challenged. He stood about 5'4" or 5'5". He made up for this with his highly adorned high-heel shoes, some of which were a full 4 inches tall. The soles and heels of King Louis XIV's shoes were dyed red. This was another show of wealth. Red dye was extremely expensive at the time. This trend spread throughout Europe to those who could afford it. Charles II of England's coronation portrait of 1661 shows him wearing a pair of French-style high-heel shoes with red heels and soles. King Charles II stood over 6 feet tall without high-heel shoes. Now, back in France, King Louis XIV became irritated when other people who were outside of his court wore red-soled high-heel shoes. It irritated him so much that in the 1670s he issued an edict which proclaimed that only members of his court were allowed to wear red-heeled shoes. This was another form of status. If you wanted to know whether someone was in favor of King Louis XIV, all you had to do was look at the shoes. Soon thereafter, women and children began adopting elements of men's dress to make them look more masculine. Women wore masculine hats, smoked pipes, and eventually adopted the high-heeled shoes. In the 1600s, high-heeled shoes for the upper classes were of unisex fashion. They went either way. Men and women wore the same type of heel. But that began to change in the end of the 17th century. Men's high-heel shoe fashion evolved into shoes with more square, more robust look, while women's high-heel shoes became more slender and curvaceous. It became fashionable for women's feet to appear small and dainty. The heels of women's shoes were often tapered so that just the tips would be visible under their clothing so as to make it appear that the wearer had small feet. In the early to mid-1700s, men's fashion shifted towards more practical clothing. Aristocrats began wearing simplified clothing, which was more practical in managing country estates. Function above form. Whereas men once adorned themselves with more jewelry than Madonna wore in a music video in the 1980s, they began abandoning jewelry and bright-colored clothing made from crazy fabrics in favor of more practical clothing. Whereas men and women had worn the same types of clothing in the 1600s, the differences between men's fashion and women's fashion became distinct. While men's clothing became somewhat subdued, women's clothing remained bright, vibrant, and largely impractical. In a lot of ways, that trend has continued in our modern era. When we think of high heel shoes today, we don't really think of masculinity. Pretty much the opposite. Now wait a minute. Earlier I said that if you Google high heel shoes, you probably won't find a listing for men's high heel shoes. But what about cowboy boots? Would you consider those as high heel shoes? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.